What's going on, everybody? It's YCS coming at you with a brand new video, and just a few weeks ago, as of recording this video, we had the 250th YCS Yu-Gi-Oh! Championship Series going on, with multiple different YCS events across the globe, allowing players from all over to participate in such a momentous occasion. With multiple events going on, this led to thousands of different duelists with different decks participating, and with so many different builds, we get to take a peek under the hood at what may have over or underperformed at such events. There are plenty of sources better than me that could easily tell you what the best decks are for the current format, which is why I decided to take a bit of a different approach, that being with the best board breakers. Should you be looking for the best hand traps after the event, I also do have a tier list up in the top right annotation featuring those as well, so be sure to check that out if you're interested or haven't already. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get right into my board breaker tier list for the April 2023 format post 250th YCS. Starting us off, we have the OG board breaker Dark Hole. So Dark Hole, a bit of an interesting spot because it affects so many decks, but there is the problem of the Kshatri-La matchup with Shangri-La being able to protect itself. However, I do still think that Dark Hole is a crazy powerful card, and when you resolve it, it's more likely than not going to end up being a complete blowout. Not to mention that Nightmare Corruptor Ibli is still a problem card that decks like Kshatri-La and Sprite are both playing, be it the main or the side. So I think that this card is probably one of the best ways to actually out it, while still also doing damage to the opponent's board, so it's not just a neg-1 trade. Next up, we have Dark Ruler, and Dark Ruler is a card that I still think is a sneaky good card because people just don't really prepare for it, right? Like, usually in a format where people aren't prepared for Dark Ruler, it's going to completely blow out their board, and yes, so Kshatri-La doesn't really care too much about Dark Ruler because Shangri-La will continue to block off your zones. But okay, if they haven't blocked all your zones, which is probably going to be very difficult unless they open the perfect hand to do the full board lock, but they're going to lose the rest of everything else on their board to this Dark Ruler because they don't really have a way to play around it other than using preparations to summon something back. So yeah, you have to deal with a few zones being blocked, but more often than not, a deck can play through that. Not to mention all the rogue decks going around or just the sheer variety of decks in general. Dark Ruler is a really good card against those as well, especially against things like, for example, Branded. If they set up like the Dragoon or something, Dark Ruler can easily out the Dragoon or help you out it in the future with your own archetypal cards. Next up, we have Droplet, and Droplet's going to be the first one in our broke category, and as I mentioned in my last board breaker tier list in March, Droplet isn't a bad card. Like, Droplet's a really good card. The main issue is that it's not in a good place right now because it doesn't do anything against Kshatri-La. The biggest thing is that you cannot activate the Droplet under the Arise Heart, and so why would you play the Droplet? And in that case, if you're not going to use the Droplet for Kshatri-La, then there's no real point in using it in the first place. Not to mention, a lot of decks can barely play through disruptions right now, and so you want to keep as many resources in your hand as possible in order to actually play through things, and so using Droplet kind of counteracts that, so there's no real need to play Droplet right now. Next, we have Evenly Matched, quite possibly the most broken board breaker in the entire game. No pun intended there. This card is just absolutely absurd. Most decks can barely play around it, if at all, and even if it gets negated, it's not a hard once per turn. So you can use multiple Evenlies in the span of an end of a battle phase, and yeah, you lose the battle phase, but they're left with like one card, and you get the rest of your hand to do whatever you want in the main phase too. Like, I remember when this card was maybe a side deck choice for the longest time, and then now it's being seen in so many main decks even. Like, that's just how good Evenly is. So yeah, if you don't have your Evenly somehow already, even after the reprint from Magnificent Mavens, please, I implore you to get your Evenlies and at least put them in your side. It's definitely a card that you want to see. Next up, we have Harpy's Feather Duster, and it is a blowout against back row decks, but the main thing is that back row decks are seeing a lot less play. So, namely, Labyrinth was like the really big threat that people were worrying about. However, Labyrinth just ended up not really doing too well at these events, and has slowly been losing representation by the day lately, and so I don't really think it's a card that you need. I would still play the one because it's just a one-of anyway, and it is a blowout, and, you know, back row matchups can be really annoying if you don't have an out for anything, but it's definitely not something that you need to, like, constantly want to see all the time because back row matchups aren't really that oppressive right now. Next on our list is Chalice, and Chalice is fine, but it does only negate one thing. So I'm moving it down to minimal from the blowout category that I had it in the last one, because remember, this category isn't necessarily like exactly what it does. Like, something that can be in the blowout category doesn't have to actually be a blowout. It's just like the amount of play that it sees or just how good of a card it is in general right now. But I'm moving it down to the minimal category because it's a fine card, but being a 1-for-1 trade right now isn't the best thing that you can do. Like, there are so many other better cards you can play, and yes, it is a quick play, so you can use it on your turn as a quick effect whenever you're already doing things, or you can set it like a trap card. However, it's not like the best thing you could play, and so I will be putting it in the minimal category for now. So next up is something we have that is very interesting, and that is Kshatri-La Div Incarnate, who for the first time is going to go into the busted category, and that was because of the showing we had in the finals at YCS London. Kshatri-La has slowly been shown to actually be a significantly better card than people had their hopes up for, initially going from like, I think it was like a $12 to $15 card all the way up to like 30, 40, even 50 a piece, and it's not really hard to see why. So admittedly, I did dog on Kshatri-La by things having to have to activate their effects, because yes, while things having already activated their effects means they could have already disrupted you, it doesn't mean that summoning a body that gets to at least 3,000 or more attack and steals something during the end phase from the graveyard is a bad card. For example, I was playing against our friend M-Rocket using Kshatri-La's, and from my side deck, I put him into my main, and I believe it was game 2, and I tributed over his Heat Soul, whose effect he had used to draw a card, and then during the end phase, I took the Heat Soul from the graveyard and used it myself to draw into an Ash Blossom. Not to mention, this card isn't a hard once per turn. As shown by the finals from YCS London, we saw 2 Kshatri-La's hit the board against Kshatri-La, which is a very terrifying sight. Sure, it's not immediate like something like Lava Golem or Sphere Mode or something like that, but it's an inherent summon that doesn't use your normal summon, that also can be used more than once per turn like these other cards, and you get them as a massive body to your side of the field with an additional steal effect during the end phase. I think Kshatri-La is a much stronger card than people initially thought, including myself, and so I do want to apologize to everyone in hindsight of that card that did hype this card up. I think it has really proven itself now that we're in a format in which it is good, and it'll probably continue to dominate top charts as long as Kshatri-La continues to be a deck. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Kaijus, and Kaijus are going to go in the minimal category. So they're going into the minimal category because they don't really do much other than out one thing. However, the one thing they do out can end up being pretty strong, admittedly. Like outing Shangri-La and getting all of your zones free without wasting your normal summon and giving them a really low attack monster. Pretty cool, not gonna lie. However, you do have to deal with everything else on their board because you're only tributing one thing. I think the main thing that's really good about Kaijus, though, is that a lot of the time, Kaijus are used for a small world bridge because, you know, for example, I believe it is Madolche that uses Kumongous as a small world bridge. This is a really bad example because the deck isn't that great, but Godi uses Gameciel as a small world bridge. And then not to mention, of course, we have Dinosaur being like the OG Kaiju searchers by grabbing Dogoron off of Overraptor. So having the utility of that, but also being able to out Shangri-La will put it at least in the minimal category because people are playing these cards. However, it doesn't really do enough for me to warrant me putting it any higher. Next up, we have Imperm, which I'll put in the blowout category at the bottom. Similar to Chalice, it can't be used during the middle of your turn, admittedly, but it is a hand trap, and Imperm is one of the better hand traps you can play right now, especially against Kshatri-La, because you're not only negating their things, but you're also preventing them from using the effect of, for example, Unicorn to rip something directly from your extra deck. Next on our list, we have Kaiju Slumber, and I'm always an advocate for Kaiju Slumber. I think this is a really cool card. I'm gonna put it below Dark Ruler because I believe, I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I don't think you can Kaiju Slumber under an Ibli because you can't special summon anything. So, not too sure, but it's still a really strong card. I mean, wiping the entire board and giving yourself a really big beater and your opponent a really small monster makes the Kaijus much more worthwhile than just playing them on their own. Not to mention, it searches more Kaijus later on by banishing it from the graveyard, so that can be absolutely huge, especially in a simplified game state when your opponent's summoning a big monster like, for example, Dragoon. Next, we have Book of Eclipse and Book of Lunar Eclipse, so these cards are still incredibly strong, and I'm tempted put them in Busted or Blowout is the big thing. I think I'll put them in Busted, like I have been the past few tier lists, I believe. I think these cards are incredibly strong, and admittedly, when it comes to Book of Eclipse, you can get ashed. However, most of the time, especially in a deck like Branded, I know I keep bringing up Branded, but it's the deck that I'm playing for the format, so it's the one I have the most experience with. You'd rather them ash something like this than, you know, Branded Fusion, for example. I think the only caveats to these cards is that when you're using them going second, against a deck like Mathmech, for example, like any Link-focused deck, it's not really going to do too much. However, you can just not side it in. It's not a card that I would warrant putting in the main deck at any time, but it's definitely a really strong side deck pick. Next, we have Lava Golem, and I'm going to put Sphere Mode alongside this as well. These are going to go in the busted category too, just under Kurikara. These cards are just absolutely insane. I mean, this literally outs the entire zone lock because no one's playing Fog King and Kshatri-La like people thought they would be. So you can just tribute both Shangri-Las, get all of your zones free, and only have to worry about, like, a Rise Heart Fenrir, I think it is. Or if you use the Sphere Mode, you can tribute the Rise Heart on top of that and almost have to worry about completely nothing. The only problem with these cards is that you do lose your normal summon as opposed to something like Kurikara, but the advantage is that you can use them early on, and with the Lava Golem specifically, it can be really good for going into time, while also, you know, for Bird Up, for example, you can crash into them with your Recital Starling and do a lot of damage or even draw the entire game. And with Sphere Mode, you do get it back, so I mean, hey, if you want free Link material, then you get free Link material. I think these are some of the most powerful cards that you can play in the format, at least any of these in the busted category. I don't think any more will be added to this category for this list, so definitely pick these up if you can, or at least everything but the Kurikara, because I know this card is quite pricey right now. I just realized, by the way, that the entire Tier List 2 category on my OBS hasn't been registering. I'm very sorry about that. It's definitely something that I can't fix in post, unfortunately, but from now on, it'll look like it's supposed to. I'm sorry. Next up, we have Lightning Storm, and I want to put Lightning Storm in the blowout category because, again, it is a blowout if it does go off. Admittedly, it's not great against a lot of the decks right now because they'll just be summoning it in defense position to play around Lightning Storm, especially Castro, for example, but just the potential to wipe an entire board of monsters or back row is definitely enough to at least consider this card for your side deck. Definitely not the main, even in a going second build, but I still personally enjoy the card, and I think it's very underrated right now. Next up, we have Regeki. Y'all, Regeki is in the same vein as these other cards, but it does have a lot less utility than these. Lightning Storm being able to pop back row, Interrupted Kaiju Slumber being able to just out entire boards, and also give yourself a really large body, and then finally, Dark Hole being able to stop things like Ibli definitely makes them all rank a bit higher than Regeki. But it's still Regeki, y'all. You're still blowing up all of your opponent's monsters for literally free, and it's not a hard once per turn either, so I mean, literally no real reason to dog the card. Next on our list is Super Poly, and Super Poly will be going at the top of the minimal category. I'm still an advocate for Super Poly to be banned. I personally do not enjoy the card. I think that a card that completely wipes an opponent's board and gives you advantage for basically no cost, kinda broken, not gonna lie. But right now, it's not really the best time to play Super Poly because there's way too much deck diversity, and even in the situations against like Castora, for example, in which Super Poly would come up, it's not really that amazing, you know? Like, even as a Branded player, I've seen people go from like the main deck Super Poly to the side deck Super Poly, and then I just completely cut it, not gonna lie. It just does not come up. I'm not quite sure when the format will come for Super Poly to be completely broken again, but I just really dread the day this card comes back. I really hate Super Poly. Next up, we have Triple Tactics Talent, one of my favorite cards in the game that I will be putting at the top of the blowout category. I did put it in Busted in the last one, but I think I would like tone it down a little bit, even though it has been seeing a lot of play. The main issue with Triple T, in my opinion, is it is a hard once per turn, so it's kind of frustrating if you draw multiple. Not to mention, it can end up being completely dead as opposed to other cards just being slightly less powerful. Like, for example, your opponent could have ended on like a smaller end board, and like your Book of Eclipse isn't as powerful as it would have been if they would have had a massive end board. But when it comes to Triple T, like, if your opponent doesn't use a monster effect at all, it's a completely dead card as opposed to being a slightly weaker card. However, this does not stop it from being an absolutely insane card when it does go off. Just has so much utility on one card, being able to draw two in order to get more extension to play through things, being able to steal an opponent's monster to either help assist your board breaking, use its powerful effect, or just rip apart your opponent's board so they have less disruptions, and even stealing from your opponent's hand, well, not stealing, but ripping from your opponent's hand, shuffling it back into the deck, and getting hand knowledge at the same time is a lot more powerful than people give it credit for. I think Triple T is an absolutely fantastic card, especially when combined with Triple Tactics Thrust in order to fetch it, or any of the other cards on this list, any of the other normal spells or traps on this list, sorry, and it's definitely a consideration if your deck is able to play it. Ultimate Slayer is a card that I keep wanting to love. I think it's a cool card, but as always, there's just not a deck right now that really makes good use of it, especially now that Flunder is such a weaker deck. It's still a good deck, don't get me wrong, but like without Barrier Statue, it's nowhere near as good, let's be real. But there's not really a deck that wants to utilize the extra deck space for the Ultimate Slayers, because like, you'd rather just have actual engine pieces, you know, or toolbox cards. And so Ultimate Slayer, especially being only a 1-for-1 trade minimum, technically it's usually 2 because of Natus and stuff like that, or by using like Aggregator, or even getting advantage off like a Link monster that you send like Farragut, but it's just not currently the format for it, but it definitely will see its time in the sun whenever a deck that can actually utilize it comes out. Next up we have Underworld Goddess. I'll put it above Ultimate Slayer this time. I know usually I put it below, but I'll put it above because it does out Towers cards, things like Psychic End Punisher, or any really big monster. You can even out Dragoon and stuff with it. But again, in the Kashtira matchup, like I always mention, how are you getting 4 monsters on board to out their problematic monster? It's just really rough. Like, your best use of this card is to utilize it with IP, or in a deck that's blinding second and already can out the Shangri-La without having to worry about like any of the other things as well. Also, I think I am going to move Droplet just above. I'll put it above, sorry, the Harpy's Feather Duster, because it does have a bit more application there. There is a lot of variety, so it can come up. I don't want to put it in the broke category because it's not a bad card by any means. But it's definitely not going to be like the greatest card right now. Next up, we have quite possibly one of my favorite cards ever printed. We have Divine Arsenal AA Zeus. This, as always, is going to go in the blowout category. This card will single-handedly win you games, and there's a reason why a lot of decks are playing 2 if they have access to it, because Kashtira is going to be panicking when they see it in your extra deck, and they really want to get it out of there as fast as possible. Being able to non-once per turn, non-once per chain, wipe the entire board and leave a 3k body on yours to keep poking directly, absolutely massive, especially after already using the battle phase, and in combination with really strong cards that can't be destroyed by battle, can attack directly, etc, etc. Finally, we have Enemy Controller, and this is a card that I believe has fallen off a lot. So a lot of people were running this card because, you know, you could like book things, I'm pretty sure was the other effect, but most importantly, you can steal things, and you can use it to dodge things like Imperm as well, and it does out things like Ibli. But I think it's been seeing a lot less play. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember seeing this in too many deck lists. Not to mention, it's like, you do have to tribute a monster in order to get the best effect, which, yes, it can help you out things like Ibli and can end up, you know, dodging things like Imperm, but more often than not, that's more of a big cost than anything, especially when you draw it in like the later turns of a game, which just ends up not being that valuable. Well, everybody, that's going to do it for my board breaker tier list post 250th YCS. This was definitely a lot more scuff than I'd like to admit. I kind of decided to record this on a whim, and it's been weeks since I recorded the hand trap one, so... But at least the data here, I believe, is mostly correct. I think that there are a lot of really powerful board breakers right now, even enough to maybe even warrant blinding second in this format. But it's refreshing to see that even with all the really nasty end boards that decks like Kashtira can end up setting up, there are so many different options that you can play in order to out these boards, so it doesn't always feel super overwhelming, even if it is a draw the out situation. Also, let me know in the comments below, what is your favorite board breaker? I think right now, Kurikara is really starting to grow on me. I managed to finally pick some up, and they've been really overperforming when they do come up. But with that out of the way, that's going to do it for the video. If you liked it, please leave a like, as I will split this video and the channel into 2 recommended. And if you like this content, you want to see more like the rest of my tier list, remember to check out the hand trap tier list in the top right annotation if you haven't seen it already. Then perhaps consider subscribing, because we're on our way to 5,000 subscribers by the end of 2023. Not to mention, it supports the channel more than anything else, and it's absolutely free. Once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.